Okay, welcome everyone. Jeff Militalo here with Dan Chase, founding partners of Actualized Performance Solutions. If you've been watching the previous videos, you'll kind of recognize this graphic that we're going to put on the screen. And what we really need to cover today is to dig into that green box, the one that says supportership, right? The one that is really the target of a leadership influence. So I guess we just start this off by asking you, Dan, why is this worth digging into?
I think because a lot of people watching this will not normally see supportership there. So this is a different model, but it's similar to other models that people have seen, where we talk about resistance, compliance, and maybe commitment or engagement, where we have intentionally included the word supportership. And so I think it's worth getting into what do we mean by supportership and how is that distinctive from commitment, and maybe another term people are familiar with, followership. Followership, just to be honest with you, a lot of people are uncomfortable, although it makes a lot of sense, but they're uncomfortable when you say, oh, if there's a leader, there are followers, or that somehow followership is a valuable component to leadership. And it is. So one of the reasons, I guess, to have supportership as opposed to followership is it implies a sense of intentionality or even power from those that are followers or subordinates in an organizational setting. They're saying, we are choosing to support this cause and this leader because they've inspired us, they've engaged us,
right,
whatever else it might be. I think that's at least one reason. There are others, right? There are other reasons, but I think that's at least one why supportership is probably a more inspiring term, maybe, than followership.
No, I agree. And, I think the thing I don't like about followership is it sounds too passive.
Yeah.
And supportership to me sounds like something that we're choosing to do. There's an action implied in it as opposed to just, well, here's an option, so I've got nothing else to do, so I might as well go do this. And maybe that's unfair to followership, but it is kind of the justification for saying, what's the companion to leadership? It's when someone chooses to own it, and it's intentional, and they choose to act. And it becomes self-sustaining on the part of the supporter. So if it's not important, then Dan, what do we got to do? I mean, how do you do this?
Yeah, well, I think there's one of the ways it's become really apparent to me, and this will sound strange to people in organizations, some people who have supporters, right, that are highly compensated, certainly well qualified, but increasingly I believe that leaders are wise that treat their supporters or their employees in an organizational setting like volunteers. And this goes back to this idea of not being passive. So one of the things, if we talk about the outcomes to influence, and of course influence is a big part of leadership, this positive influence. We talk about, as I mentioned before, resistance, compliance, and compliance is death, right? And then commitment, right? Well, supportership also speaks to this idea of commitment.
Yeah.
And commitment is something that you and I are engagement, right? Our commitment is something that we have to volunteer to the leaders. We decide whether we give that. If I'm compliant, I'm not likely getting fired. That relationship with the organization is not likely to be terminated. So what do we mean by this idea of treating people like volunteers? At least in two ways. Even if this is a paid subordinate in an organization, in two ways they are allowed to volunteer things. The first is choosing to be with your organization in the first place. They get to decide whether or not they work for you or work someplace else. And of course, we know most turnover, right, is costly, it's inefficient, it's problematic for most organizations. And so the first thing we want them to volunteer is we want to be an organization that is seen as a destination organization. In other words, people volunteer, they choose to work there. The second component is this idea of discretionary effort, commitment, or engagement, or their supportership. People get to choose whether or not they give that to you. Because again, if they're compliant, they're not going to get fired. And so we have to figure out ways, instead of just, I pay you, so you should be here and do work, a very transactional dynamic, we need to figure out ways as leaders, if I didn't have that control mechanism over these people, how would I get them to want to be here and to want to give full-throated support and full-force effort to what it is that we're trying to do here?
So to be clear then, you are advocating, it's a mindset.
Yep.
Because there are realistic challenges in leading volunteer organizations that almost kind of lend themselves towards seeking compliance sometimes. But what you're saying is It's a mindset and an approach that seeks to extract and produce the conditions that extract support out.
No, that's well said. That's exactly it. So here's the truth. Leaders, whether you have paid employees or not, whether, and again, they might be well compensated, you are leading volunteers. Now, you might not be managing volunteers. You might be managing compliance, but the second we realize that what we want is supportership, and if we're really going to accomplish noble and important, purposeful ends, we have to have supportership, because without supportership, there is not leadership, and without leadership and supportership, there is not movement, there's not energy to accomplish and change and do big and important things. Then you realize, actually, you manage volunteers, you lead volunteers, because they choose whether or not they are simply employees, right? Versus supporters, followers, right? Committed followers or supporters, and giving supportership in this case. So it is costly to those that want to be leaders to say, no, these are my employees. You are going to lose out on discretionary effort, organizational citizenship behaviors, commitment to the organization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
You know, in relation to that, I'd say over the years, if you want to really kind of simplify organizational environments, you can think of them as push environments, which you might call a compliance-oriented environment, or a pull environment, which you might incline towards one that is really anchoring in achieving supportership.
Yep.
And I was in a training session not too long ago where they're talking about, change really only gets tough when you start working with humans, in essence, right? But if you think about achieving change and this importance of supportership, really, the business case is there under any circumstance. It just is. Because if you are going to achieve change, often people need to change the way they think. In push environments, they're not prone to do that.
No.
In pull environments, they do. And so this notion of the mindset required to actually tap into that supportership by viewing them as on a volunteer basis, or you might call a pull environment, I think might be the only way to actually achieve sustainable change. I mean, if you care about your cause and you do a push environment, as a leader, when you leave, the cause is probably dead.
Yep.
If you create a pull environment, though, and achieve supportership, that's where sustainability is found.
Well, and I would say this is where some of this marriage between process and operations and any other thing that we do to help implement change, whether we bring new policies, new processes, new procedures, new technologies, I really think without that mindset change that you're talking about, and people saying, yeah, I'm going to volunteer this, I'm going to help this happen, it stalls. And we see that over and over. And I think that's important for leaders to understand, right? I mean, in fact, let me share one last thing if I can. Really, we talk to groups all the time about people who are leading or aspiring leaders, and say one of the most common questions is, what's the difference between leadership and management, right? And you come up with these lists. Really, the more effective question, and we've shared this before, is what's the difference between someone who's only an employee versus someone who is an active supporter? Right, an engaged supporter.
Yeah.
That's really more important, because they're the ones that decide. Just like, and by the way, I can be an active supporter and an employee. I still am getting paid. Just like someone who's a manager can also be a leader. And so these things aren't mutually exclusive, but it's ultimately, if I am just a manager or a leader, it's decided by others. Right?
Yeah.
We've talked about that, whether they decide to be just employees or active, engaged supporters. And so you can't ignore this. If you want to be a leader and you want to make change and move things forward, you can't ignore supportership.
Well, and I think maybe to wrap, herein is the basis, really, of this triage of outcomes from leadership offerings, which is to say that the power really only comes when it taps into people. Yep. And it becomes an extension of them, and that is how leaders connect with supporters.
Yep.
And so if you really want lasting change, and if you have a cause that is worthy of time and effort and sacrifice, supportership's the way to go. And to extract it out of the pull environment for treating them like volunteers. Yeah. So powerful stuff today. We'll try and give you more powerful stuff over time. Make sure you kind of stay tuned with us as we do things on Facebook, LinkedIn, on our website, blog posts. But in the meantime, any closing words, Dan?
Nope. Good talking with you.
Parsimony. Okay, thanks. This first part's always awkward.
Oh, I hate it. So I'm like, Aaron, you do that intro. Like the intro and the closing, I'm like, no, that's on you.